Egypt versus Sumer. Egypt and Sumer both formed around rivers to take advantage of the fertile land around them that was caused by the flooding season. However, that's where the similarities end. The Egyptians' Nile River had a very regular flooding season that made it very easy to grow crops. The Sumerians, on the other hand, lived around the Tigris and Euphrates River, which had a very irregular flooding season that made it much, much harder for the Sumerians to grow food. The Nile River was also surrounded on all sides by desert, making it very difficult for invaders to conquer the Egyptians. The Sumerians were surrounded by land that was very easy to pass through, which made it easier for them to be invaded. In fact, they were invaded many times. The fertility of the Nile and the difficulty of invasions allowed the Egyptians to live isolated from the dangers of the world, causing them to live better lives overall than their Sumerian counterparts. The Sumerians believed their kings were sent down to earth as representatives of the gods. But the Egyptians took it a step further and believed their pharaohs were gods. Both the Sumerians and Egyptians, however, shared common beliefs that there was more than one god, and each god represented a component of nature. For example, the Egyptians had the sun god, Ra, the god of death, Osiris, and Anubis, the guide of the underworld. In the afterlife, Anubis would weigh your heart, and if it was lighter than a feather, you got eternal life. If not, a giant monster would devour it. This was a key difference between Sumerian and Egyptian religions. Sumerians had such a rough time making a living that they didn't even believe there was an afterlife. In fact, they believed their gods were angry all the time and had huge mood swings due to their irregular flood cycles. Because of both Egypt and Sumer's farming-oriented society, they both believed in many gods that were derived from nature. However, Egyptians had a better outlook on life compared to the Sumerians because they were more secure in their food supply due to their geography. The societal structure in Sumer and Egypt were both very similar. In Egypt, the pharaoh was always at the top, followed by the priests, nobles, merchants and artisans, farmers and laborers, and lastly slaves. In Sumer, the king of each city-state was at the top, followed by priests, nobles, scribes, merchants, farmers, and slaves. Both Egypt and Sumer were very similar because they were both farming-oriented societies. As a result, they valued similar things, such as scribes being considered very important, priests always being second highest due to their connections with the gods, and slave status at the bottom for being war prisoners or debtors. In both societies, there were two ways to move up the pyramid or ziggurat. You could either actually earn your success, or just marry someone who was higher up. The biggest difference between Sumer and Egypt was that Sumerian society valued men above women, and in Egypt, men and women were considered equal. Both Egypt and Sumer had similar social hierarchies due to their farming-oriented society. However, Egypt had a much more equal society compared to Sumer because the roles men and women played were equally challenging in Egypt, while farming was much harder in Sumer.